what happened yesterday, February 12th, was Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth said something that we have been saying ever since we've been doing this podcast on Ukraine, which is that there will be no settlement and no cessation of hostilities until the U.S. gets up and tells the truth to the Ukrainian leadership and the EU leadership, which is now indistinguishable from NATO, which is that Ukraine will not be a part of NATO.
We want, like you, a sovereign and prosperous Ukraine. But we must start by recognizing that returning to Ukraine's pre-2014 borders is an unrealistic objective. The United States does not believe that NATO membership for Ukraine is a realistic outcome of a negotiated settlement. Instead, any security guarantee must be backed by capable European and non-European troops.
We'll play some more clips from Hegseth's comments, which are about a week out of the Munich Security Conference, which will be pretty interesting. But Aaron, what's your initial reaction?
Well, my first thought upon hearing Pete Hegseth say that was that if Biden had been willing to say that 3 years ago this month, almost to the day, so many people's lives would likely have saved, in the hundreds of thousands, Ukrainians and Russians, because that was Russia's main demand before it invaded. Yes, they put out a very comprehensive proposal, but at the heart of it was that Ukraine renounced the invitation that George W. Bush pushed through in 2008 for Ukraine to join NATO. That was the main ask, and Joe Biden refused to say it because he talked about we have this open door to Ukraine. NATO has an open door policy, and we don't take membership off the table. We're not going to listen to Russia. And because Biden refused to take it off the table, we had a war. And the reason Biden refused to take off the table is because he wanted a war. He wanted to use Ukraine to bleed Russia. And that's why after so many people were killed with Biden presiding over it, then Biden said at the end of his presidency that, you know what, Ukraine's not even ready for NATO membership because they're not democratic enough and they're too corrupt, which is funny because Biden's own family had profited off of Ukraine corruption via his son Hunter getting a lucrative energy company board seat shortly after the 2014 coup that Biden was involved in. So Biden, for the sole goal of using Ukraine to bleed Russia, refused to take NATO membership off the table. And finally, with Biden ousted from office, someone new comes in and says the obvious, that, yeah, this is crazy to promise membership to a country that is parts of which have long been part of Russia's political sphere, in which there are millions of people who identify with Russia, who speak Russian, and to try to promise membership in a hostile military alliance right on Russia's borders is folly. And finally, we're going to formally renounce that. And that's what Pete Hegseth did. Just reading the writing on the wall and no longer committed to the Biden policy of sacrificing Ukraine to bleed Russia. So, I mean, it's good someone finally said it, but so many people's lives could have been saved had Biden been willing to say this 3 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, the Europeans know, NATO knows Ukraine is not going to be a member and they're never going to execute Article 5 on behalf of Ukraine. Europe is not going to send troops. They know it. So why were they doing this? They were dangling NATO membership out before Ukraine, as well as EU membership, to get them to dump an entire generation of Slavic bodies into the slaughterhouse on their behalf, for their profits, for the growth of NATO, and for a war which Europe wants to continue to fight. I mean, the EU is furious about this. And Pete Hegseth, I mean, he's following Trump's guidance here. He stuck it to NATO in a kind of bizarre way, but he stuck it to NATO as well in a way that I've never seen any defense secretary do.
Well, like President Eisenhower, this administration believes in alliances, deeply believes in alliances. But make no mistake, President Trump will not allow anyone to turn Uncle Sam into Uncle Sucker. Thank you, and we're glad to take some questions.
So that's how he closes his remarks. We're not going to allow Trump's not going to allow Uncle Sam to become Uncle Sucker. And I heard I'm having some audio issues here.
Well, only and you can do this as I'm talking.
When I play clips.
Yeah, just turn off the echo. Turn on echo cancellation. But
it's on and it will it'll improve. But I'm going to I'll just mute myself when I play clips.
Okay. I mean, who's the real sucker though in the situation? It's not Uncle Sam. I mean, although of course this costs U.S. taxpayers a lot of money, which by the way, Zelensky recently said he can't even account for. He said that, something like the U.S. has spent over $150 billion, but Ukraine's only gotten half of that. So he said, I don't know where the money is. But the real sucker is Ukraine and Europe, who played along with Biden's strategy of using Ukraine to bleed Russia. Let me read to you David Ignatius, Washington Post columnist, very close to officials at the CIA and the Biden administration. And this is how he recently described the Biden strategy. It was a sensible, cold-blooded strategy for the U.S. to attrit an adversary at low cost to America while Ukraine was paying the butcher's bill. So there's David Ignatius making it plain. And butcher's bill is a military term, which refers to taking heavy casualties. So that's correct. Ukraine was paying the butcher's bill, taking heavy casualties, just so that the U.S. under Joe Biden could attrit an adversary at low cost to America, except for, of course, well over $100 billion that could have been spent on people's needs at home rather than sacrificing Ukrainians to bleed Russians. But that's him making it plain. That's what it was. So the suckers here, contrary to what Pete Hegseth said, is not Uncle Sam. It's Ukraine that signed up for this, that let itself be used, and the European states that totally subordinate themselves, undermine their own economic well-being, undermine their own security by playing along with this. And now they're being shown their place. Trump, people are outraged that Trump called Putin first before Zelensky, but that this was always going to happen because Ukraine is not a partner. In fact, there's that clip of Trump being asked by reporters, is Ukraine an equal partner in these talks? And he said, that's an interesting question. He wouldn't even say yes. And although one could attribute that just to Trump and say that's his view, actually, no, that's been the dominant view so far. Because if Biden really saw Ukraine as an equal partner, then he wouldn't have sabotaged the peace deal that Ukraine negotiated with Russia back in the spring of 2022, which was blocked after the U.S. and UK refused to back it up, as Boris Johnson personally told Zelensky. And this is how one Ukrainian official, speaking to the Financial Times, now describes the mood in Europe. Okay. This is what this Ukrainian official says about Europe. It's clear that everyone is waiting for Europe. Sorry, it's clear that everyone is waiting for Trump to tell them what to do. And that's correct. Everyone in Europe is now reduced to being a vassal of the US and waiting for instructions from Uncle Sam, the boss in Washington. And that's the dominant mood. And what they're being told is it's time to shut up. We don't care anymore. We spent enough money on this. And we are, this is according to their public statements, winding this down. Of course, with Trump, we always have to issue a caveat. You never know. He's very untrustworthy. He says things on a whim. For example, last week he almost blew up the ceasefire deal in Gaza by demanding a new deadline by which everyone had to be released. So you never know. There could be something to change his mind, like perhaps a false flag, and that gets used this way. Who knows? You have to account for these possibilities. But if this policy proceeds as it looks like, then yes, this Ukraine proxy war is winding down, and it will be Ukraine and Europe to basically bear the cost of it. And already they're being told their place, which is essentially that they have none at the table.
And reinforcing your point, Aaron, here is NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, former PM of Netherlands, a European leader waiting for Trump to tell him what to do.
Well, listen, in Washington, again, NATO committed to future NATO membership for Ukraine. But it has never been agreed that whenever peace talks would start, that peace talks would end anyway and always and definitely with NATO membership. That has never been agreed. It could be, but it never was that clearly stated. What I consistently have said is we have to make sure that whatever the outcome is, we have to make sure that Vladimir Putin will never, ever try again to attack.
So, I mean, now this is the rats fleeing the sinking ship. So now Rute's saying, oh, yeah, we never said that if there's peace talks, then Ukraine will join NATO. The whole point of this proxy war was to fight Russia for Ukraine's so-called right to join NATO. That was the open door policy we talked about earlier. And, Mark Ames pointed this out. Rute is changing his tune very quickly because this was him not too long ago. Ukraine is closer to NATO than ever, Mark Rutte says during Kyiv visit. So, and that was back in March of 2024. So not too long ago. All of a sudden, the master in Washington changes their tune. And now the NATO Secretary General says, yeah, we weren't always so firm on NATO membership, but we never said that if there's peace, then necessarily Ukraine still has to join. The whole point, and this is what Jens Stoltenberg said too, Rute's predecessor, that Putin went to war because we wouldn't take NATO for Ukraine off of the table, because we won't do that because of the open door. So Rute sees the writing on the wall and now is completely switching his story. And there's a lot more, there's many more examples of that we can go through.
Yeah. We never cynically dangled NATO membership as if it was some kind of Hunger Games where the more soldiers you throw into death, drive off young men against their will to the meat grinder, the more likely you'll get into NATO. You're almost there, Ukraine. You're almost there. We never continued doing that even after it was clear that Ukraine had absolutely no possibility of retaking the territory and bringing all of the NATO gooners to Crimea for the beach party on Crimea, the summer beach party that had been promised. 16 months ago, Ukraine's counteroffensive under the guidance of Mark Milley and the Pentagon totally failed. We said it here. You didn't hear it here first. Others were saying it, but you heard it here. The counteroffensive was clearly going to fail. It was, and so many lives were wasted. And it was being hyped up by Jeffrey Goldberg and Ann Applebaum on the pages of the cover of the Atlantic. That's how you knew it was going to fail. The same people who hyped up the Iraq War were hyping it up. That was it. Okay. Now Ukraine is getting rolled back in Kursk in large numbers. And there's no hope for them retaking territory. So what we're seeing from the Trump administration is a concession to the obvious. And the art of the possible, this was always possible. But what we're saying is it was preventable, and that hundreds of thousands of lives were wasted because of NATO. I mean, this is a titanic crime, and of a part with so many other titanic crimes on the NATO worst hits list: Libya, Afghanistan, Yugoslavia, and the West itself. What it did to Russia in the 90s was a Vietnam-level crime. So will it be understood that way in the West? No, it's going to be, they're trying to spin it against Trump as though he's retreating and that he's allowing the Nazis to win. This is the kind of liberal take. The British are freaking out right now. They're in total meltdown on their little island. They were guiding, as Kit Clarenberg has illustrated again and again with leaked documents from British military intelligence planners. The British were guiding this war and trying to drag the U.S. deeper and deeper into it with Biden's enthusiastic consent. But what will they do now? I think the Trump administration is putting Britain in charge of NATO planning, which is great. It's like, hey, we don't want anything. We don't have anything to do with this anymore. Why don't you guys actually take charge for once? Because your military is a joke. And if you're so into this, you do it. Do it yourself. We're not going to be Uncle Sucker. I don't know who Uncle Sucker is, by the way. It sounds like Uncle Ruckus from the Boondocks, but I don't know who he's talking about. But I like the spirit of it. I can't believe I'm saying it about Pete Hegseth.